Hi everyone. When you're thinking about reading aloud to your students, what are the genres that you tend to think of? In the past, I typically read realistic fiction, sometimes fantasy, sometimes science fiction, and oftentimes I would read historical fiction, but hardly ever did I read nonfiction. And I want to make the case that there's a reason to do that, and a good reason. I started to do that last year and found that I had a lot of students engaged in a way that I hadn't expected. First of all, a lot of nonfiction these days is written narratively, so it reads much more like a story than a collection of facts, and that makes it very readable and very easy for students to listen to. The thing that surprised me was how much students were able to connect with. They were able to make a lot of connections to their world, to their parents and grandparents, to experiences that other people had had, and even to experiences they had read about in other books. So text to self, text to text, and text to world connections came flying left and right in a way that I hadn't anticipated. One of the things that I love about nonfiction, and a reason I think you should consider it, is because it is so cross-curricular. There's an awful lot that you can read that has to do with social studies, or where you can teach science concepts. You can include art or music. It's a wonderful way to combine something that you're reading, something you're discussing, but not just make it a reading focus, but to make it focused on one or more other content areas, which I think is really appealing. Read-alouds, I think, as you know, are great places to teach reading strategies. And the same thing is true with nonfiction. You can make a lot of examples from your text to model questioning. I do that lots of times, like, oh, I didn't know about that, and I'll talk about that in just a minute with some of the books that I'm going to introduce you to. People that I hadn't heard of, or places that I wasn't familiar with, and stopped and modeled for students how I would ask questions, and also what we needed to do next. And sometimes students volunteer to find the answers, which is a wonderful way to engage them. There are ways that you can show problems that lead to solutions. There are ways that you can show sequence of events, causes and their effects. You can compare and contrast different people and the experiences they had had within the book, or from that book to perhaps another book that you might have read with students, or that students might be familiar with. It's also a great place to teach context clues and vocabulary, and you can model that. And also, we get into this in fiction a lot, but I think there's a place for it in nonfiction also, and that is the author's point of view, and also the author's viewpoint. Why is the author writing this, and what perspective is the author coming to the book with? Now, I have a planning page that I use when I am doing read-alouds. If there's a particular skill that I want my students to be mindful of, and you can download that sheet down below, which is available to you free. But the biggest point that I want to make is, having said all of that, my philosophy with read-aloud is, I do a lot of teaching during the day, and I think sometimes it's just really good for kids to sit and to listen. I can model fluency, I can model tone of voice, I can model enthusiasm or quiet, the starting and the stopping of reading, or the slowing down of reading sentences. And so I just want them to listen. That doesn't mean we don't have great conversations, but I try not to do a ton of teaching with read aloud, because I think it's just a place for students to listen. But I do want to tell you about 5 books that I think are particularly wonderful for read aloud, and have engaged my students in a lot of really cool ways. And so I'm going to start. So the first book is called Lost in the Pacific, 1942. I read this it's by Todd Olson. I read this for the first time last year, and there were a number of things that were interesting about it. It is the story of a plane carrying a superhero, a great American hero, who whose name I had never heard of. And my sense is that our students' generation, maybe even my generation, have not heard of him. But people who fought in World War II and certainly in World War I knew his name very well. His name was Eddie Rickenbacker. And Eddie was on this plane, which crash landed in the Pacific and was lost at sea for 3 weeks. Lost at sea in 2 inflatable rafts, 8 men, 2 rafts, and very, very little food. I was surprised by the number of connections that students made with their knowledge of World War II. It really was a wonderful read, and students were pretty excited when they got to the end of the book, even though there are multiple hardships throughout. So that's the first book that I wanted to tell you about. The second one is a very different kind of book, but I think it's got some powerful pieces to it also. It's called I Will Always Write Back, and it is by Caitlin Alfirenka and Martin Gonda. Caitlin was a middle school student when she was assigned a pen pal project, and she had about as much interest in that as a lot of things. She didn't seem to be too into school at that point, but she decided that she was going to pick a student's name because he happened to come from Zimbabwe, and most of her friends were picking people who came from Europe, and she thought Zimbabwe sounded like a really interesting country. Good for her. She wrote to Martin. Martin wrote back. Martin was a Zimbabwean student who was chosen out of his class to be one of very few students who could respond to these pen pals because he happened to be very bright, and they picked the top students to respond. Their story is the beginning of a friendship that started in middle school and has lasted until today. Martin, poor, dirt poor, and Caitlin, I would say probably upper middle class, and in some ways initially a little bit unaware, as you would expect a middle school student would be, of what life was like for Martin. She did something sort of without thinking about it. She sent him a $1 bill one time just to say, here's what American money looks like. What does Zimbabwean money look like? And she, not realizing that that $1 bought him so much. And I think that's when her level of awareness started to open up. The thing that's really neat about this book is it's told in alternating chapters. And so you read one of her chapters, one of Caitlin's chapters, and then one of Martin's. And it makes for a very, very powerful, talk about being able to compare and contrast, really powerful story. They are friends today. Martin is in the United States, and most of it is because of Caitlin's help. A great read aloud. The third one I want to tell you about is one of my favorites. I've actually done a novel study for this one, which is available on Teachers Pay Teachers if you're interested. But this is a powerful story, and I know it's become more popular because the movie was made. The movie took a slightly different point of view, but I'm partial to books. This is the story of 4 African-American women. Their names are, and I'm going to look here, Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden. And these women were very smart mathematicians, had gone to college. Most of them were math teachers. During World War II, when so many men enlisted or were drafted and fought, there was a need for women to work. And I think a lot of students are familiar with the need for women to work in factories and things like that, but they might not be as aware of the fact that NACA, that's the precursor to NASA, needed women, mathematicians specifically, to be computers, to compute their numbers so that they could figure out how to get planes to fly. Remember, at the beginning of World War II, World War II was the war where planes became a mode of warfare. And so these women ended up getting hired. And this is the story of their fight for respect for who they were, fight for respect for who they were as African Americans. They were working in a segregated, for a segregated organization, fighting for their rights as women, There's a whole infusion of the civil rights movement that you could study with your students, and a lot about the space race too. I found out some very interesting things about our involvement when Russia, decided to put a man into orbit. And so it's a really, again, another powerful book with a very strong social studies and even a science and physics twist to it. The fourth book is probably my all-time favorite, but I'm partial to all of these books, so that's probably not saying a ton. I Am Malala is the story of Malala Yousafzai. This is another book that I have a novel study for if you're interested. That's on Teachers Pay Teachers. I am just blown away by Malala. She is just a bundle of thoughtfulness and pride and a willingness to express opinions that she knows are not always necessarily popular. And that has gotten her into trouble, deep trouble. She tells her story growing up in Pakistan, and as the Taliban came in and took over, and reasons why, she gives some good background for why people would connect with the Taliban and what they were doing to help people rebuild villages and build roads and do things like that. When those folks are helping you out, it's hard to see them as being the bad guys. They were extremely conservative religiously. Pakistan is mostly a Muslim nation, as is Malala. And so that sort of became the way people started to believe. There were a number of people who resisted the movement or spoke out against it, and a number of them were killed. And Malala, as you may know, was shot in the head, airlifted from her small town eventually to England, where she was operated. And today, actually this year, she just turned 20 years old. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Really powerful story. Talk about growth mindset and perseverance, and also what I found with my students who are reading this is very, very little understanding or knowledge of either the Muslim faith or of anything about Pakistan. And so this was really eye-opening for them. So another really good book. And then finally, this last book is by Susan Bartoletti Campbell. Susan Campbell Bartoletti. And it's called Terrible Typhoid Mary. Susan Campbell Bartoletti, I always mix up her last name, has written almost exclusively nonfiction. And this one is a really fascinating account of the woman who, unbeknownst to herself, carried the typhoid gene or the typhoid virus in her body, but didn't know it because she didn't get sick. And unbeknownst to her, was causing other people to get sick. She was a cook. She was a really good cook. And she was hired by very affluent families who lived in New York City and oftentimes went to Long Island for the summer. And this is the story of how she was tracked down and also the fight that she gave. So you hear it from both perspectives, because there was no way to prove that she had this virus for a long time, and she didn't think she had done anything wrong. And if you look at it from her point of view, you certainly understand that. Although you can also understand, if people are dying, that something needed to be done. What the decision that was ultimately made and what happened to her is also kind of a fascinating story. Today we have different approaches, but in the early 1900s, this is the way things were handled.